Welcome again to Heart of a Shepherd. We continue our study in the book of Judges, chapter 11 and 12. The title of the devotional, A Harlot's Son Becomes a Hero and a Trophy of God's Grace. I invite you to open your Bible with me to Judges chapter 11. Well, let's begin with a review of Judges 10. And we found Israel had turned to the Lord and putting aside their idols. The people had once again committed themselves to serve the Lord. However, when the Ammonites began to gather against Israel, the country found itself without a judge. Now, there were those living in Gilead, Gilead being the land on the east side of the Jordan River where the 2.5 tribes resided. Those men began to ask, "What man is he that will begin to fight against the children of Ammon? He shall be a head over all the inhabitants of Gilead." Judges 10, verse 18. Well, Judges chapter 11 now, we're introduced to Jephthah. And here we find the leadership and the judgeship of Jephthah, the Gileadite. Consider them with me, verses 1 through 3. First of all, Jephthah's low birth. Now, at that time, there was a man named Jephthah, the son of a man named Gilead, who lived in Gilead, the territory on the east side of the Jordan River. Now, Jephthah was not among his people as a mighty man of valor, a courageous man, perhaps a great warrior. However, Judges 11 and verse 1, his mother was a harlot. Now, the same Gilead, who was the father of Jephthah, also had sons with his lawful wife. And when those sons grew up, we read that they rejected Jephthah, the son of a harlot, as an illegitimate son and therefore not an heir. Consequently, Jephthah's brothers cast him out of their household in verse 2. And we read in verse 3 that he retreated to the desert, where he was joined by vain men, lawless, worthless men. Then we come to Jephthah's promotion to be commander. Chapter 11, verse 4 through 11. Now, when the Ammonites began to wage war against Israel, the leaders of Gilead, the 2.5 tribes on the other side of the Jordan, the leaders of Gilead sought a leader. And so they sent a message to Jephthah, this mighty man of valor, saying, "Come and be our captain, that we may fight with the children of Ammon." Verse 6. But Jephthah seized the opportunity to address the irony of their invitation to lead Gilead, and he did not immediately accept the leadership role over them being the Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. Now, interestingly, some of his brothers, perhaps, the very ones who had rejected Jephthah as their illegitimate son, may have been among the elders who sought now his leadership. Well, we read in verse 10 how the elders of Gilead took an oath to the Lord that Jephthah would be their ruler if he were victorious. But Jephthah then recognized God's providence. And we read in verse 11 that he took on the leadership of his people. Thus, Jephthah became the 8th judge of Israel. Consider then verses 12 through 28, where we have Jephthah's accord with the Ammonites. And so after becoming the leader of Gilead, Jephthah sought peace with the Ammonite king. But he denied the king's claim to the land of Gilead. And he emphasized that Israel had owned that land for 300 years, as it was their inheritance from the Lord. You know, I'm reminded of Solomon's writing over in Ecclesiastes where he says there's no new thing under the sun, and indeed there isn't. When you read Judges chapter 11, it reminds me so much of what is happening in the United States today. We have many that are not born in America. They are illegals dwelling in the western portion of America. Many of them are from Mexico, and they claim that America has no legitimate right to the land because it belongs to Mexico. Well, there is a saying, and it is that to the victor go the spoils. And so it is that in the Mexican-American War, America defeated Mexico. And that land has been in our possession now for over 200 years. It is the land of the United States. And so it goes that we learned the same thing happened in Israel long ago. And so the Ammonites demanding the land on the east side, and Jephthah saying, oh no, that is Israel's inheritance. Well, as he was facing battle with the Ammonites, Jephthah made an ill-advised vow and victory that's recorded in verses 29 through 33. Now, after being assured that the Spirit of the Lord was with him, we know that Jephthah vowed to the Lord in verse 30, saying, if thou shalt without fail deliver the children of Ammon into my hands, then it shall be that whatsoever cometh forth of the doors of my house to meet me, whoever comes out of my house first to meet me, when I return in peace from the children of Ammon, shall surely be the Lord's, and I will offer it up for a burnt offering. Therefore the Lord granted Jephthah and Israel a great victory in verses 32 and 33. And now we come to Jephthah's consternation and sorrow, beginning at verse 34 through verse 40. So when Jephthah returned from the battle, his daughter was the first to meet him. And he remembered his vow to the Lord and suddenly was overcome with sorrow. Jephthah accepted that his sacrifice to the Lord would be his daughter in verse 35. Loving and humble, Jephthah's daughter received the consequences of her father's vow and requested 2 months to mourn that she would never bear children. Now remember that last statement. She was mourning not her death, but that she would never bear children. In his zeal, then, Jephthah had made a rash vow to offer as a sacrifice the first person who came out of his house to meet him in verse 31. But remember, though human sacrifice was a practice of the heathens, it was forbidden by God's law, and by the way, and it was against nature. And so Jephthah's sacrifice was not the life of his daughter, but that she would live a celibate life. That is, she would never know a man, therefore never bear a son or daughter to be her father's heir. That brings us to Judges 12. Now in Judges 12, we have once again an introduction to the tribe of Ephraim that I'm going to suggest a full twice over. Now, do you recall how the tribe of Ephraim in Judges chapter 8 had confronted Gideon when he returned victorious from battle? Now, at that time, the Ephraimites had complained that they were slighted because they had not been invited to fight against Midian in Judges chapter 8 and verse 1. Once more in Judges 12, the men of Ephraim raised the same disingenuous protest when Jephthah returned victorious from his battle with the Ammonites. Notice Jephthah's dispute with the Ephraimites in verses 1 through 6. Now, still grieving his daughter's celibacy, Jephthah was confronted by the men of Ephraim who, true to their nature, complained of being slighted. Incredibly, Ephraim gathered to wage war against Jephthah. They threatened in verse 1 of chapter 12 to burn down his house and suggested he had failed to call on them to join the fight. Well, Jephthah's response revealed the Ephraimites' hypocrisy in verses 2 and 3, as they had been called to war, and yet they had refused. Well, when Jephthah could not reach an agreement with Ephraim, Jephthah rallied his army for battle, and he went to war against the tribe of Ephraim. And in verses 4 through 7, he killed 42,000 men from that tribe. Well, the concluding verses of Judges 12 provide a brief account of 3 judges who succeeded Jephthah. But for the closing thoughts of this study, I want to remind you that Jephthah, the son of a harlot, was an unlikely hero. Like Joseph, who was rejected by his brothers and sold as a slave in Genesis 37, Jephthah experienced the rejection of his brethren as an illegitimate son and therefore not an heir. And yet, with the Spirit of the Lord, Jephthah became a hero in Israel. What an amazing story of God's grace and power. He understood the sorrow of rejection, but when God called him, he rose to the challenge and was used mightily by God. And for some in Israel, Jephthah was undoubtedly the last person they would have chosen to lead the nation. And yet, he proved to be God's man for such a time. I'm reminded of the words of the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, beginning in verse 26, and we read that not many wise men after the flesh, and not many mighty, not many noble are called. But God hath chosen the foolish things of the world to confound the wise, and God hath chosen the weak things of the world to confound the things which are mighty. The base things of the world and the things which are despised hath God chosen, yea, and things which are not, to bring to naught things that are. Why? That no flesh should glory in his presence. Wow. If God can take a man named Jephthah, who is the son of a harlot, cast out of his home, disowned, and God turn around and use him to be a great warrior and judge of Israel, what's preventing you from trusting and serving the Lord? Well, what a great study. I look forward tomorrow to introducing to you Samson. God bless, and bye-bye.